My fiancée demanded I send my kids to boarding school for her alcoholic brother. When I kicked her out, he stole $50,000 from her, and she came back begging. But my answer left her speechless. I'm 38 years old. I'm a single father of two incredible kids, Aiden, who's 12, and Charlotte, who's 10, and what happened a few months ago still has me processing everything, honestly. I need to tell this story because I basically almost made the biggest mistake of my life, and if I hadn't reacted in time, I don't know where my kids and I would be right now. I guess I should start at the beginning, when I met Rachel about a year and a half ago at a barbecue that some mutual friends threw. My wife died 4 years ago, cancer, and it was devastating for all of us, but especially for the kids because they were super young when it happened. Aiden was like 8 years old and Charlotte was barely 6, and I basically had to learn to be mom and dad at the same time. You know, braids, homework, parent-teacher conferences, everything. I'm not gonna lie, the first 2 years were brutal, like waking up at 5 in the morning to make lunches, take them to school, work, pick them up, help with homework, make dinner, bathe them, and crash only to repeat everything the next day. My friends told me I should start dating someone, that the kids needed a mother figure, but I wasn't ready. I mean, and it still hurt too much, and besides, I didn't want to bring just anyone into my kids' lives, you know what I mean? But then, like 2 years after my wife died, I started to feel like maybe I was ready to try again. Not because I needed someone, but because I missed having a partner, someone to talk to after the kids went to sleep. You know, that adult connection that gets lost when you're raising kids alone. I went on a couple of dates that were terrible, literally terrible, and I was already resigned to the fact that maybe this whole finding a partner thing just wasn't for me when I met Rachel at that barbecue I mentioned. Rachel was 34 years old, worked in marketing or something like that, and honestly, she caught my attention right away. She was pretty, confident, funny, and when we started talking, it turned out we had a lot in common, like the same taste in movies, we laughed at the same things, and the conversation flowed naturally without those awkward silences I'd had on other dates. By the end of the night, we exchanged numbers and I thought, well, maybe this could work. We started going out, just the two of us at first because I wanted to be sure before involving the kids, and things were going well. Really well, actually. We'd go out to dinner, to the movies, walks on weekends, and after like 3 months, I felt it was time for her to meet Aiden and Charlotte. I remember I was nervous, like super nervous, because my kids are my number one priority, and if they didn't accept her, then it wasn't going to work. Period. But Rachel made a real effort to connect with them, or at least that's how it seemed at the time. She showed up with board games, asked about their interests, listened when Aiden told her about his soccer team, and when Charlotte showed her her drawings. The kids didn't get excited right away, obviously, because they still missed their mom. And I think part of them felt like they were betraying her memory by accepting someone new. But they didn't completely reject her either, which was already something. Fast forward like 6 months, and things kept going well. Rachel would come over on weekends. Sometimes she'd stay overnight in the guest room, because I wasn't going to have her sleeping in my room with the kids in the house. That seemed inappropriate to me. We'd cook together, watch movies, like a normal family dynamic. Aiden was still a bit cautious with her, which I understand because he's the oldest and probably felt like he had to protect his little sister, but Charlotte was starting to open up more. One day, Charlotte asked Rachel if she could teach her how to make colored bracelets, and Rachel spent a whole afternoon making them with her, and I thought, okay, this can work. We can be a family. After like a year and a half of being together, I decided I wanted to propose to her. I know it sounds fast, but at my age and with 2 kids, you're not playing around anymore. I mean, if you're going to be with someone, it's because you see a real future with that person. I took Rachel to the park where we used to walk. It was a Sunday afternoon. The weather was perfect, and I got down on one knee and proposed. She said yes immediately, like she didn't even think about it. And I was happy, the kids were happy, or at least they didn't protest, and we started planning the wedding for 6 months out. But this is where things started getting weird. And looking back, I should have paid more attention to the signs, because they were there, totally there. Like 2 weeks after we got engaged, Rachel started making comments about the house. We live in a 3-bedroom house that I bought with my wife years ago. Nothing fancy, but it's our home. You know, it's full of memories and the kids grew up here. Things like we should redecorate, that there were too many of the kids' things everywhere that we needed to make space for when she officially moved in. At first, I thought they were just normal comments, like obviously she'd want to put her personal touch on the house, but then she got more specific. One day we were in the living room and Rachel pointed to the family photos I have on the walls, including some of my wife with the kids when they were babies, and said that maybe it would be good to put away some of those photos, that it was time to move on. And that bothered me, honestly, because those photos are part of my kids' history. It's their mom. I'm not going to erase her from our house just because Rachel's uncomfortable. I told her the photos were staying and she rolled her eyes, but didn't insist at that moment. So I thought she'd understood. Then she started talking about her brother Scott. She mentioned that Scott was going through a rough time, that he didn't have a job, that he was struggling with some personal issues. He later found out that basically meant he had problems with alcohol and couldn't keep a job for more than 2 months, and that as family, we should be there to support him. I said, sure, obviously, we all go through tough times, thinking she meant like inviting him to dinner or helping him look for work, not what she really had in mind. Then one day, I think it was like a month after the engagement, Rachel casually mentioned something about boarding schools in front of the kids. We were having dinner and she said something like, "Oh, my cousin sent her kids to a boarding school in another state and they love it. They learn a lot and become more independent." Aiden looked at me with wide eyes, like panicked, and I told Rachel that we weren't considering boarding schools, that my kids were going to stay here with me. She laughed and said she was just sharing information, that it wasn't a big deal, but something about the way she said it made me nervous. Things came to a head, like 2 weeks later. Rachel came over on a Saturday morning. The kids were upstairs in their rooms doing homework, and she sat down with me in the kitchen with a super serious attitude. She told me we needed to talk about our future, about what our life was going to be like after we got married, and I thought, okay, this makes sense. It's a normal conversation for an engaged couple. But what came out of her mouth next was completely unexpected and, honestly, left me frozen. Rachel told me, literally these were her words, "I think we should consider sending Aiden and Charlotte to boarding school, at least during the school year, so we can have our space as a couple and also so Scott has a place to stay while he recovers." I just sat there processing what I'd just heard because I couldn't believe she was saying this seriously. I asked her if she was joking, and she said no, that she'd been thinking about it a lot and it made sense that the kids would benefit from the structure of a boarding school and that we needed time to consolidate our relationship without the responsibilities of full-time parenting. I got up from the table because I felt like I was going to explode. I told her my kids aren't going anywhere, that this is their home, that I'm their father and I'm not going to send them away just to make room for her brother who I don't even know well. Rachel got defensive and started saying that I didn't understand how hard it was for Scott, that he really needed help, that as his sister it was her responsibility to take care of him, and that if I really loved her then we'd find a way to make this work. And that's when I started seeing who Rachel really was, like the mask fell off. I told her I understood she wanted to help her brother, but that there were other ways to do it, that we could help him find an apartment, get him job interviews, connect him with support groups, whatever, but that my kids weren't going to be displaced from their own home. Rachel looked at me with a coldness I'd never seen before and said, "Then I guess you have to decide what's more important to you. Your future with me or clinging to the past with your kids." And when she said, "clinging to the past," it made me so angry because my kids aren't the past. They're my present and my future. They're everything to me. I told her to leave, that I needed time to think, and she left in a rage, saying she was giving me an ultimatum, that either we found a solution for Scott and the kids or there was no wedding. After she left, I went upstairs to talk to Aiden because he'd heard part of the conversation from upstairs. Our house isn't that big, and when someone yells, you can hear everything. My son was sitting on his bed with red eyes, like he'd been crying, and he asked me, "Dad, are you going to send us away?" My heart broke, literally broke, and I sat down with him and told him never, that I would never in my life send them anywhere, that this was their home, and always would be. I thought maybe Rachel would come to her senses, that she'd said all that in a moment of frustration and would apologize, but that's not what happened. 2 days later, she showed up again, but this time she brought Scott with her. And when I say she showed up unannounced, I mean, literally, they rang the doorbell on a Tuesday night when we were having dinner, and there they both were. Scott was a guy around 32 years old. You think? He never told me his exact age, looked like he hadn't showered in days, with a super arrogant and entitled attitude that rubbed me the wrong way immediately. Rachel introduced me to Scott as if it were the most normal thing in the world that she'd brought him without warning me, and Scott walked into my house like he already lived there, like he didn't even wait for me to invite him in. He sat on my couch, put his feet on my coffee table, and said, "So this is gonna be my room," pointing toward Aiden's room. I looked at Rachel like, "What's going on here?" And she told me she'd decided that the best way for me to see that Scott really needed help was for me to meet him in person, and that she'd already started looking at boarding schools for the kids. I exploded. I told Scott to get out of my house immediately, that he wasn't welcome and never would be, and I told Rachel that this was over, that the engagement was canceled, that I wasn't gonna marry someone who asked me to choose between her and my kids. Scott started yelling at me that I was selfish, that his sister deserved better, that he needed a place to stay and I had plenty of space. Rachel tried to calm me down, saying we were being dramatic, that we just needed to talk calmly, but I'd already made my decision. I got them out of my house, literally pushed them toward the door, not violently but firmly, told them I didn't want to see them again, and closed the door. The kids were in the dining room watching all this. Charlotte was crying, Aiden was pale, and I had to sit down with them and explain that Rachel and I weren't getting married anymore, that she'd wanted to make changes that weren't good for our family, and that always I was going to choose them first. I thought that would be the end of it, that Rachel would understand she'd crossed a line and we'd just move on with our separate lives. But oh no, things got worse. Like 3 days later, I got a message from Rachel, demanding that I reimburse her for half the deposits we'd made for the wedding. I'd paid like 70% of everything, the venue, the catering, the photographer, everything. Because I make more than her, and because I wanted us to have a nice wedding, and she wanted me to give back thousands of dollars that technically I'd lost too by canceling. I responded that no, that she was the one who caused the breakup with her ridiculous demands, and that I didn't owe her anything. But then she started telling our mutual friends that I was a controlling father, that I didn't let her have a voice in decisions about the house, that I'd been abusive to her. Completely false. I never laid a hand on her or raised my voice before that day. I got her out of my house. And basically trying to paint me as the villain. Some friends believed me, others not so much, and I lost some friendships over that whole situation, which hurt, but honestly I didn't care as much as protecting my kids. Then Scott started sending me threatening messages, saying he was going to make me pay for treating his sister badly, that he knew where I lived. Obviously he knew. He'd been to my house. That he was going to come teach me a lesson. I saved all the messages and went to the police to report him just in case, and they said they couldn't do much unless he actually attacked me, but to be careful. I got a little paranoid for a while, like checking the windows before bed, making sure the doors were locked tight, and asking a neighbor to keep watch in case he saw Scott hanging around. But then, like 2 weeks after the drama, I got a really long message from Rachel, and this message was revealing because it basically confirmed everything I'd suspected about her and Scott. Rachel told me that Scott had stolen money from her bank account, like thousands of dollars she'd saved, and that he'd disappeared without a trace. She told me she didn't know what to do, that she was financially ruined, that Scott had used her credit cards and now she was in debt up to her neck. And then, and this is what made me angriest, she asked me for help, told me I was the only person she could trust, that she needed me to help her financially until she could recover. I couldn't believe it. This woman who'd asked me to send my kids away to make room for her thief brother, who'd accused me of being abusive, who'd demanded money I didn't owe her, was now asking me to rescue her from the situation her own brother had gotten her into. I replied with a very short message saying I was sorry about her situation, but it wasn't my problem, that she'd chosen Scott over us and now she had to deal with the consequences. I thought that would be enough, but then, like a week later, Rachel showed up at my house. It was a Sunday morning. The kids were having breakfast, and I heard the doorbell. I opened the door, and there she was. She looked terrible, like she hadn't done herself up, with dark circles under her eyes. Obviously, she'd been crying. She told me she needed to talk to me, that she was so sorry, that she'd made a huge mistake by prioritizing Scott, that now she understood I was right, that Scott was a lost cause, and she'd been blind not to see it before. For a second, and only for a second, I felt sorry for her because it was obvious she was suffering, but then I remembered what she'd tried to do to my kids, how she'd wanted to displace them from their own home, and that pity disappeared. I told her I appreciated that she recognized her mistake, but it was too late, that what she'd said and done had no going back, that she'd shown who she really was, and I wasn't going to risk my kids' well-being by giving her a second chance. Rachel started crying and begging, saying she loved me, that she missed the kids, and that we could start over. But I just shook my head. I told her I wished her the best, that I hoped she could resolve her situation with Scott and her money, but that we weren't going to be part of her life. And I closed the door, literally closed the door in her face, and I turned around and went back to the kitchen where my kids were waiting for me. Aiden asked me if Rachel was coming back, and I told him no, that we weren't going to see her anymore. Charlotte asked if that meant we didn't have to go to boarding school, and I told her they were never in danger of going anywhere, that this was their home and always would be. I saw the relief on their faces, and I knew I'd made the right decision, that no matter how much I'd loved Rachel or how much I'd wanted to have a partner, my kids were always going to be my number one priority. It's been like 4 months since all that. I haven't heard from Rachel or Scott again. I blocked their numbers and their social media, and honestly, I'm not interested in knowing how they are. Some friends have asked me if I regret ending things, if maybe I should have tried to reach a compromise, but no, not for a second do I regret it. A compromise? Send my kids to boarding school halfway? Not in a million years. Last week, Aiden told me thanks, Dad, for not sending us away, and I told him he'd never have to thank me for doing what I'm supposed to do as his father. Charlotte has gone back to being the happy girl she was before Rachel started with her comments about boarding schools, and Aiden is more relaxed. He no longer has that worried look he had when Rachel was in our lives. Do I miss having a partner? Yes, sometimes. Do I feel lonely? Also sometimes. Would I date someone again? Maybe someday. But right now, I'm fine being just me and my kids. And the next time I decide to bring someone into our lives, I'm going to be much more attentive to the warning signs. I'm going to be much more careful, because this experience taught me that not everyone who says they love you really has your best interests at heart. And definitely not everyone is ready or willing to accept that my kids are part of the package. Non-negotiable. Last night we were watching a movie, the three of us in the living room, Aiden on my left, Charlotte on my right, eating popcorn like we used to before Rachel appeared in our lives, and I thought, this is enough. This is more than enough. I don't need a partner who asks me to choose between her and my kids. I need someone who understands that they and I are a complete package, that this house is our house, and that any person who comes into our lives has to respect that, or they simply have no place here. And until I find that person, if I ever find her, we're going to be fine like this, the three of us together, in our house, living our quiet life without drama or ridiculous ultimatums.